All right, in this video we are going to finish up our discussion on section 4.1 data. Of course, you can review the learning objectives from the first video, and basically we've gone through and saw that this particular section on data has an absolute huge amount of vocabulary, and knowing what the vocabulary is, recognizing it, played a significant role in our discussion. To continue our topic, we're going to look at this question of how do you go and get data? Well, the first type we'll look at is a sample survey. In a sample survey, you will get data from only part of the group. For instance, if we wanted to do a research, if we wanted to conduct research on the students in the high school, we could take a portion of the high school. Maybe we would go and ask questions of 10 students. Perhaps we would look at the students in Mr. Moran's classroom, because of course he doesn't have all the students in the entire high school. In a survey, you look at a group of the population, not everybody all together. Okay, a census is different from a sample survey only in the characteristic of who you're doing your research on. In order to be a census, you need to get data on everyone. Going back to that example I just mentioned, if we are going to do research, if we're going to conduct research on the high school, we would have to collect our data on everybody in the high school, 100%, to make it a census. For a sample survey, you don't need 100%. You can do 10% of everybody, 30% of everybody. If you wanted to have a really huge sample, you can go 90% of everybody. But in a sample, you don't get 100%. In a census, you do. That's the only difference between them. Next two vocab we'll look at are experiment versus observational study. In an experiment, the researcher, which is typically you, the researcher Redea pointed out, I spelled that one wrong. I don't know what my brain was thinking. Whoa, I didn't want that. Oh well. I don't know. My brain didn't connect to my pen and I spelled it wrong, so oh well. Thank you for correcting me. Okay, in an experiment, the researcher does something to the subjects. In science, remember how you'd usually have your control group and then the experimental group? A lot of those same designs that you would set up in science are the same types of things we would do in statistics. You set up your control group, you set up your experimental group, and then you collect data on them. As I'm sure you remember from your science classes, it's not always ethical to create a control and an experimental group. Some of the classic examples were if you want to figure out if arsenic is poisonous, Is it ethical to give people arsenic to see what happens?
Yes.
Not so much, because if it turns out that it is poisonous, then you're out there killing people, and that's not such a good thing. So under certain circumstances, you can't actually create the control and experimental group, and you're left with just looking at stuff that has already happened. In that instance, when you just look at stuff that has already happened and you're not creating an experiment, those are observational studies.
So is our
Hang on a sec, let me write this.
observational?
Observational. Man, apparently spelling is not my thing today. So in an observational study, the researcher is not going to do anything to the subjects. Basically, you're just watching and recording what is happening or what already happened naturally. And so for our last example of the day, well, not just example A, but we have example 4, A, B, C, multiple parts. Read the situation and then try to identify, is this a sample or is it a census? Or as well as, is it an experiment or an observational study? Okay, researchers suspect that aspirin could help reduce the risk of having a heart attack. 700 people who are aged 40 or older are willing to participate in a study. Half of them were randomly selected to take aspirin every day. The remaining participants were given a pill that looked like aspirin but contained no actual medicine. The study went on for 5 years and the participants' health was monitored. So consider this. Is this a situation where we have an experiment, or is this an observational study? What do you think? Okay, remember, in an observational study, researchers don't do anything. They just watch what happens naturally. Well, if I pick half the people to have aspirin and half the people to not have aspirin, did I do something? Absolutely. I have made a choice of who gets aspirin and who doesn't. So since the researcher is doing something, that makes this problem an experiment. How do we know? Because the researchers did something by assigning aspirin to one another, or to each group. To continue further, is this a census or is it a sample survey? A census gets everybody. A survey is only part of the group. Well, did they give aspirin or a placebo medicine to everybody who's 40 or older, or only part of the group of people 40 or older? Only part of them, so this is a sample. Oh, this is a sample survey. Because of course, could you possibly give medicine to everybody who's 40 or older? Man, you're looking at a couple million, or in our country, you're looking at probably, what would you say, 200 million people? Good luck keeping the records on 200 million people and whether or not they take aspirin every day. I just don't see that one happening. For 5 years straight, yeah, good luck. Okay, question B. In an effort to study how the high schools in Minnesota have been preparing students for college, an extensive questionnaire was developed. 10% of high school juniors at every school in the state were selected randomly to complete the questionnaire. So, is this a census or is this a sample survey?
Sample survey.
Sample survey. Why is it a sample survey?
Because they only use 10% of the high school.
Perfect, right there. Because they're taking 10% of juniors, not everybody, that makes it a sample survey. Absolutely. Okay, let's look at it next. Is this an experiment or an observational study? Well, we'll go back to the classic question. Did the researchers do anything to these juniors? Or are they just getting information about what happens naturally? All they're doing is gathering information. You're absolutely right, Joe. Since all they're doing is collecting information about what schools are already doing, that makes this an observational study. Question C. Researchers suspect that tanning beds cause skin cancer. Every time a person was diagnosed with skin cancer, they were asked a series of questions, including whether or not they'd used a tanning bed. If they had, further questions were asked about how often, what type, at what age, etc. Is this an experiment? I'm sorry, let's do this first part. Is this a sample survey or is it a census? Was this being done to part of the group who had skin cancer or everybody who had skin cancer?
Everybody.
It was everybody. Each time somebody was diagnosed, they asked them the questions. So given that this is happening to everybody who gets skin cancer, that makes it a census. So we've got a census. Now we will continue and answer the other question. Is this an experiment or is it an observational study? Did the researchers do anything to the group of people with skin cancer? Or did they simply record information about what happened naturally? Yeah, it's not like they didn't go through and create a control group. They're not looking at it and saying, oh, Joe and Chance and Alex, we want to know if tanning beds give skin cancer, so you guys go hang out in this tanning bed for a while, okay? They're not doing anything like that. All they're doing is they only look at it and say, what has already happened? You already have skin cancer. So now let's go back and observe things that happen naturally and see if that causes anything. So this one is an observational study. In an effort to determine how many fish were in Lake George, they drained the lake and all the fish were counted. So, is this a sample survey or a census? Definitely a census. They took all the fish in the lake and they counted them. Is this an experiment or an observational study? What do you think? Did they do anything? Well, they drained the lake, yes, to count the fish. Because frankly, if you were trying to conduct a census, how else would you get to all the fish? Fish them, yeah, take them all out. Catch every single fish in the entire lake. In this instance, did they set up an experimental group? From a scientific procedure, did they have a control group and an experimental group? No.
Lake was drained.
Yes, they drained the lake, but they're not looking at any kind of like a cause or effect. They were observing how many fish there were in the lake in the only way that they possibly could.
That's a lot of water.
So draining the lake, they did not set up an experimental group. They did not set up a control group. All they were doing was observing how many ways or how many fish there were in the lake in the only way that they would be able to do a complete census. Now, of course, we can recognize this is really stupid. Draining a lake to count the fish would be really, really stupid. And so nobody would ever do this. That's the same reason that if you were actually trying to count the number of fish, you would never be able to do a census. You would have to do some type of a survey. Here's your assignment. You've got the rest of the period to work on